Hello and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Maddie Dimmick, the Marketing Specialist here at Core Business Solutions. In 2021, the DoD announced changes to the CMMC program known as CMMC 2.0. The government plans to begin rolling out the requirements for formal CMMC certification through new contractual requirements soon. Today, we will review the latest updates from the DoD on CMMC 2.0. We would like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for promoting this event today. We have numerous MEP and PTACs who are now known as Apex Accelerators, co-sponsoring our webinar today. Your local Apex Accelerators are available to bridge the gap between your business and the government. Apex Accelerators are here to assist you with local, state, and federal contracting. MEPs provide the tools and resources to help U.S. manufacturers succeed. Each center connects manufacturers with government agencies, universities and research facilities, and trade associations that foster growth and innovation. Contact your local Apex Accelerator or MEP for more information on how they can help your business succeed. We have two industry experts on CMMC here with us today. Scott Dawson is president of Core Business Solutions and has headed up the development of Core's cybersecurity programs for NIST, CMMC, ISO 27001, and other compliance requirements. Rick Crick is the Director of Security Solutions here at Core and has been keeping up with all the latest changes and updates to CMMC to share those with you. Thank you to the both of you for joining us here today. I'm excited for this topic. I'm sure a lot of you have been looking forward to this and figuring out what has been going on. But Scott, can you kick us off and just explain a bit more about what CMMC 2.0 is for those who maybe aren't as familiar with this?
Yeah, glad to, Miss Maddie. CMMC 2.0 is the upcoming certification program from the federal government to certify the cybersecurity capabilities of the defense industrial base, all 300,000 companies that are a part of the defense industrial base. And they call it CMMC 2.0 because they are in the process of making a final revision to the original version. It seems hard to say out loud, isn't it? But back in late 2019, early 2020, CMMC was first announced, and that was kind of the first version. But before it could be deployed, it was pulled back for revision. And you can see on the screen here some of those revisions. So they scaled back the number of certification levels from 5 down to 3. And they also reduced the complexity by eliminating the requirements around processes. They just have requirements around practices. Both CMMC level or 1.0 and 2.0 have as their foundation the NIST 800-171 standard put out by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. That is a list of cybersecurity practices that a company would need to have in place in order to become certified. But as I said, it is yet coming. We'll talk more about what we know about what to expect as we prepare for the release of CMMC certifications, CMMC 2.0. It's not yet a live certification that's available, but there are, in fact, specific cybersecurity requirements in place today. So I think everyone needs to be aware we're kind of in a two-phased approach, and we're in phase 1.
Great. Thank you, Scott, for that. I hope that was helpful for those viewers to kind of fuzzy on what is CMMC 1.0 and CMMC 2.0. Rick, we've also heard a lot of different terminologies and acronyms thrown out throughout CMMC. Can you go over each one and kind of go over how they're related, some of the bigger terms?
Sure. The first one you've probably heard about is the SPURS. That is the Supplier Performance Risk System. That is where the DoD keeps the information that you have based on the NIST 800-171 system security that you go through, your system security plan that you've developed. It's based on the assessment methodology from the DoD. So that's the SPURS. That's where we keep that information. Then you have your NIST, NIST, which is your National Institute of Standards and Technology. That is the NIST 800-171. That's where the requirements come from. There are 110 requirements that you have to address in this self-assessment that you do. You need to determine, are these controls in place or aren't they in place? And if they're not in place, when do I plan to put them in place? That is where you get your SPURS score from. Then you have the DFARS, which is the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. That is the document that calls out the NIST 800-171. So that is where the NIST document comes from. And then the CMMC basically is the NIST 800-171, but requires a third-party certification. So NIST only requires a self-assessment, whereas CMMC requires a third-party assessments for level 2. Now level 1, there's a level 1, which is 17 controls, and that can be a self-assessment. Those 17 controls are come from the 110. So if you look at it from the flow, you have the DFARS, which gives you the NIST. The NIST gives you the requirements. The requirements then, using the DoD's assessment methodology, allows you to put the score into the SPURS database. And the CMMC is the next evolution, the certification process.
Very good. Thank you, Rick. I think that was a great explanation and see how they all connect. So Rick, could you also go over a little bit about what the current status of the CMMC implementation is and what government contractors can expect in the near future?
Well, right now it's in that holding pattern. It is waiting for the final rule to be approved. That final rule will put the CMMC in place so that it can be placed in government contracts. So once again, it has to be signed off by a number of entities within the DoD and other agencies. And at which time that gets signed off, then we'll be able to move forward. But right now, the NIST is a requirement, and people need to adhere to that. So when you're following the NIST 800-171, you really are preparing for that CMMC certification when it comes down the road. So that's kind of where we are right now in a holding pattern. There are some voluntary joint assessments, and we'll mention those a little bit later on, but that's kind of where we are today.
Yeah, and it's likely that it's getting pushed to 2024, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Scott, then we've heard a lot of prime contractors are putting a big push on cybersecurity, whether it's NIST or SPURS or CMMC. What are primes responsible for with regard to their suppliers and their compliance?
Yeah, great question, Miss Maddie. And I think it deserves just a bit of background to understand how primes are going to have to go through their certification, and I guess more importantly, what would qualify a prime to bid on a federal contract. So when we talked about prime contractors, we're talking about those companies, whether big or small, who directly contract with the federal government. And then from there, those prime contractors might need parts or materials or services, or they may have partnerships with other organizations, and that would then be the first tier supplier to the prime. and those suppliers then might also need to have parts, materials, services provided, which means there are potentially second tier subcontractors and third tier and fourth, and in some cases, 5 or more tiers.
Mm-hmm.
So in huge aerospace contracts, for example, they can have as many as 6 or 7 tiers in the supply chains and can have thousands of companies to fulfill a single prime contract. So with that as kind of the backdrop of this, when a prime contractor in the future is bidding on a contract that requires CMMC certification, that means that not only have they got their company certified. So think of Boeing or Lockheed or other large corporations. They need to get themselves in compliance with CMMC. They need to get their cybersecurity up to that level. They need to have a third-party assessment, and they need to have their own certification. Mm-hmm. Yet it doesn't stop there, because Rick referred earlier to the regulatory documentation called DFARS, and those regulations spell out that in addition to the requirements that you would have to meet regarding NIST, you also have to flow down those requirements to your suppliers, from whom you receive CUI or send CUI. There's an exchange of this technical documentation, and if you've been following this topic for a number of months, you know that CUI stands for Controlled Unclassified Information. So in today's world, the DFARS regulation says that not only does does your company, and I'm going to use a prime contractor as an example, need to be certified or need to be in compliance, but you have to include that clause, DFARS 252.204-7012, otherwise abbreviated as DFARS 7012. You'll hear us all talk like that. But you have to take that clause and put it into your subcontract so that your subcontractor is now under obligation to meet that same requirement. And then, in turn, they may have suppliers where they have to flow down that requirement to the next tier and the next tier. As long as CUI is being exchanged, one direction or the other or both, so it could be there's documentation going both directions. If CUI is exchanging hands, then both parties have to be in compliance with the DFARS regulation, which means in compliance with NIST 800-171, which will mean in the future soon being fully CMMC certified. All right, now I've overcomplicated it a bit, but it's a tangled story. Now, since there is time for additional preparation with the delay that Rick talked about, the prime contractors are using this year to flow down DFARS regulation, to communicate the importance of becoming NIST compliance to their suppliers and the entire supply chain, and starting to include some hooks either in their contracts or in their supplier qualification process or in their supplier surveys, or in a number of fashions they are putting requirements into the dealings with their suppliers to ensure that either we'll see that they are requiring different manners. I'm not going to steal Rick's thunder because we're going to ask him how this all works, but the background of this is that the prime contractors are not wasting this year.
Yeah.
They are absolutely pressing forward with their own preparations and pushing preparations down through their supply chain so that next year and year after, in the near future, they're prepared and their suppliers are prepared to be qualified for bidding on a contract that has CMMC requirements. So, Maddie, that's, I don't know, a long answer to your short question, but I think it's important to know why these things are happening in the market and in the industry.
Yeah. I feel like with CMMC, there are a lot of long answers for short questions. So, but thank you,
That's
Scott, for
exactly
breaking
right.
that down. So, Rick, Scott kind of touched on the flow down requirements from primes to their subcontractors. Can you explain that a little bit more and go into a bit more detail about the flow down requirements?
Yeah, as you pointed out, there is that requirement that states that the flow down has to take place from one tier to the other. And keep in mind, it's all dealing around that CUI and that flow down of that controlled unclassified information. Some of the clients I've worked with, their primes not only have said you need to be compliant by submitting a SPUR score, they're interested in a certain level of that SPUR score. So they might say, we want you to have a score of 30. That tells us that you have a large number of controls in place. So it's an indicator of where your maturity is in relationship to cybersecurity. So that's all in preparation. I mean, part of it is a requirement today through the NIST 800-171, which has been in effect since 2017. So they're starting to get more serious. Not that they weren't serious way back then, but we're getting closer to when CMMC will become a real thing, and everybody wants to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
And getting ready. So yeah, we're seeing more and more emphasis on the second and third tier customers out there to be compliant with the NIST 800-171.
Yeah.
Hey, Rick, can I just jump in here and ask you a question? Have you
Sure.
seen any prime contractors asking about or requiring, and I'm going to put this in air quotes, CMMC certification today?
I've seen people reference that, and I tell the clients, look, CMMC is not been officially released. You can't get certified to it today. Everything that your certifications are all tied in with that CMMC. Right now, the requirement is being compliant to the NIST 800-171. So, talk to your supplier or whoever that client is, and just try to put all the controls you can into place. But there's a lot of mislabeling. I've seen a lot of people say, well, we're being told we have to be compliant to or certified to CMMC level, 2. Well, you won't find any assessors out there assessing a level 2. Even with the joint assessments that are happening between the C3PAOs and the DIBCAT, they come in as a high-level assessment with the DoD in the SPURS database. So even those joint assessments are not a level 2 certification.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a negotiation or getting some clarification with your customer. If you see that, say in a survey that's sent out, that's where I've seen it, in a supplier survey.
Yeah.
And I think it's a little bit of the primes getting out over their skis, just a little bit.
Yeah.
Getting ahead of things, just a little bit.
Yeah. That's a good point. Thanks, Scott. Well, Scott, back to you. Let's just talk a little bit about what the government is doing in the interim since CMMC has been delayed, as Rick mentioned earlier. To start, could you just explain a little bit what a DIBCAC assessment is and why it's important to the defense contractors?
Yeah, great question, Maddie. And there are a lot of people who hear about assessments being available today, and that is true, but we're not talking about CMMC assessments. As Rick pointed out, there is an organization called DIBCAC, kind of hard to say. It stands for the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center. That is an auditing group within the DoD. Is growing pretty rapidly in terms of having professional assessors that are part of the DoD. And in order to help prepare the private sector third-party assessors called the C3PAOs, see if I can get it right, CMMC third-party assessment organizations. I think I got that right. So the C3PAOs are the ones that will actually do CMMC certifications starting in a year or so. But they've got to get prepared. So CMMC assessors, people have been applying to become assessors. They are joining the C3PAO organizations. The C3PAO organizations have to themselves get approved. And part of all of that training and approval is for the government and the private sector assessors to do assessments together. And the reason that they're doing those together is so that the government can be I guess I'll say a role model for how they want these assessments to go. They can demonstrate the assessment techniques and what the correct responses would be and what to do if there's a finding and such. And they can also observe the C3PAO assessors, the private sector assessors, in their conducting of assessments. So they do these joint assessments. They do it based on the SPURS score. Okay, so we all recognize that SPURS score is a self-assessment score that is submitted to the SPURS database. So let's say out of 110 points, you submit a score of 90, just saying you're doing a good job, you've done a lot of work, and you got a score of 90. Well, that company has submitted that score can voluntarily raise their hand and say, hey, we would like to be assessed. We volunteer to be assessed by the DIBCAC and the C3PAO assessors to validate our SPURS score. So to validate whether or not we correctly submitted a 90, or should it have been an 85, or could it have been a 95? So they're getting some feedback. That's the benefit, I think, of being a volunteer. Is that you would get some feedback, but boy, you're getting feedback from the A-list auditors. You've got the government in your building and the assessors that are in training, and they're going through, like with a fine-tooth comb, shall we say, turning over every stone, whatever analogy can I use, to ensure that your score is in fact accurate. And they'll write a detailed report and such. And they refer to that, that as a voluntary assessment. It doesn't officially count toward your CMMC certification yet. We've heard it might give you some bonus points or extra credit, or might even allow you to get an initial certification. Not totally sure how all that's going to work out until the rules come out. We won't know for sure. But there are, in fact, last I read, Rick, 38 C3PAOs that are qualified at this point who have worked through this joint assessment with the DIBCAC. And I think the number keeps going up. But if you imagine the flood of requests, I don't know if there's going to be a flood, but I think there's going to be a flood of requests when this all goes live. And you have 38 companies trying to certify all of the supply base. That's unrealistic. They're going to need a whole lot more. And they're trying to get a running start on this. And this is the year for that training and qualification of auditors. That's kind of what it's all about. And it avoids the government from having to do all these audits, their assessments. They're trying to train private sector assessors to do it. So that's what they're doing this year.
That's great, Scott. I think that's great information. Just to kind of see behind the scenes a little bit what's been going on, because I think a lot of people have been kept in the dark and they hear about it, but they don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. But Rick, we understand that there's different levels of DPCAC assessments. Could you explain what these levels are and how they differ?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. There are 3 levels. You have your basic level, medium assessment level, and your high assessment level. The basic assessment level is just looking to make sure that you have submitted a SPUR score, that you have the proper documentation. They really don't get into the weeds at all here. It is just to make sure, I put it this way, that you've done due diligence. Whereas the medium level assessment is where they will look at more of your documentation. It is all primarily virtually. They'll ask some questions of the contractor to do a high level verification on your score to make sure that it's accurate. So that would be basically the medium level. Whereas the high level, a lot of times would be done on site. That's where they do a huge amount of scrutiny. They will look using the NIST 800-171A, which brings in the assessment objectives. So if you think of the 110 controls and you expand them out to around 320 assessment objectives. So what they've done is for each one of the practices or controls, they've broken them down into a number of subcategories, if you will. And each one of those categories have to have an assessment objective. So that is what they do in the high level. So they really do a lot of scrutiny on that. And then your score gets submitted into the SPURS database as a high-level assessment. So it does a lot of verification and validation and examining of the data. So we go from very light touch to a deep dive in the assessment process.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rick, I would expand on that comment you made about the assessment objectives a little bit, because the assessment objectives are what the assessor looks for in order to confirm that the individual practice or control is effectively in place. And that's why it breaks down into that level of detail. But I would say the way we should think about it is when an assessor is in your facility doing an assessment, whether in the voluntary program or next year or two in a CMMC assessment, they're going to be looking at the detail level. They're going to be looking at, and they need to have evidence of compliance at the 320 level. So it wouldn't hurt for you to not only download the NIST 800-171 requirements from the DoD website, or NIST website, but also the 171A. Maddie, I think we're planning to email that link out to everyone afterward. But just not to get overwhelmed, because it can quickly get overwhelming, but to understand the level of detail these assessments are going into in the voluntary program and will go into under CMMC. This is fair warning that this is not really like an ISO audit. You know, we're ISO consultants and we're familiar with how ISO audits go. And the ISO standard is pretty high level. It's very generic, I guess is a way to say it. Doesn't spell out any real detail. Kind of leaves it up to you as a company to fill in the details. That is not at all what it's going to be like with a CMMC assessment. Now, they do allow you to determine how you meet the 320, but boy, they've got a checklist highly detailed checklist they're going to go through. But good news is you can download the test and study for it ahead of time. I'm saying that because Rick's a former school teacher, so I'm just giving a little shout out there, Rick.
Yeah, well, with that, now I was a science guy when I was teaching, so I wasn't the English guy. But when I talk to my clients about this, I say, if you can remember way back in English class, and for some of it's longer than others, it's kind of like diagramming a sentence, breaking it down into its components. And that's exactly what they've done here for the 110. They've broken them down into the components. And then they're going to be looking at it either from a testing perspective, interview process, or examination process to get that verification and that validation. So even though I'm not the English...
Well, I appreciate that analogy, Rick, because I remember the diagramming that I got so confused on. I never did it right. But I think, well, this topic is not necessarily new, quote unquote, to CMMC. I think it's new information to a lot of people who have been studying the 110 requirements, but haven't yet opened the other book to see what's in there. I think it's important that you do that. I think it's important to get some training on it. And to go through, if you've gone through the 110, which all of our listeners should have done thus far, if you've submitted a SPUR score, you've already done that. You may have only used the NIST 800-171 standard, the 110, because that's what you're scoring against, is 110. But just recognize that there's much more detail to come. So it's probably good to go ahead and get the 171A. Stands for assessment, I think. And it's just a different document. It's much more extensive. It's good to go ahead and get a jump start on that. Now, if you're a glutton for punishment, Rick, I don't know if that's the right politically correct way to say this.
Yeah.
You could volunteer and get on the list to let them do these voluntary assessments in your facility if you'd like to do that. But I think most of our clients are happy with getting training, getting some consulting, doing some preparation, getting their SPUR score up to date, keeping it up to date because it should be updated periodically.
Yeah.
Those type of things. So yeah, it's a thing and it's coming, and we don't want people to be unprepared or surprised because you'd hate to think you're ready. And then schedule an assessment and pay for an assessment, and find you weren't ready. That would be a disappointment.
Absolutely. So Scott, how are C3PAOs and their assessors involved in the DIBCAC assessments?
Yeah, Maddie, let me just reiterate that point because I think it's important to know.
Yeah.
This is the training period for the C3PAOs and their assessors. And they're being mentored by the DIBCAC assessors. And so they're shoulder to shoulder, side by side with the DIBCAC assessors who are looking over their shoulder, providing examples to follow, providing feedback and critique to ensure that those assessors are meeting the standard, and only if they do then they get qualified to become an official CMMC assessor. So we're in that phase right now, and it'll continue at least through the end of this year, I would expect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good to know. Also, Scott, what impact will CMMC have on government contractors, and how can they prepare for its implementation?
Yeah, this is the big question. The biggest impact is that this is going to be a go, no-go gauge for being qualified for defense contracts in the future. So today there's a go, no-go gauge. It's called the SPUR score.
Yeah.
So if you're submitting if you're a prime contractor, you are not eligible to be awarded a contract unless there is a score on file in the SPUR system. Doesn't necessarily indicate what that score needs to be today, but you have to have a score. So a blank score would be failure, and any other score would qualify you to be eligible to receive a contract. That doesn't mean you should keep a low score or even not prepare. You can range from a negative 230 something, I think, Rick, all the way up to a positive 110 in the crazy way they calculate SPUR scores. Okay, and that we had a whole session on that in the past. Yeah, so the SPUR's submission is the go no go. When CMMC 2.0 is released and approved, and then and that will mean that the DFARS clauses, DFARS requirements will be updated and republished. That's how it'll be released. And when that happens, then on some scheduled basis, it'll start to appear in contracts, in prime contracts. And I believe they're going to phase it in. They won't immediately have CMMC in all the contracts right away, but they'll phase it in. And so if CMMC is required, certification is required, then you wouldn't be eligible to submit a bid without the certification, Rick. I think that's how it's going to work, as opposed to today, you can't be awarded if you don't have a SPUR score. I don't know exactly the time frame if you have to have your CMMC to even submit a bid. Do you know? I don't think I know that answer. But anyway, regardless, it'll be a prerequisite. And that means to be prepared for this upcoming contract that would have CMMC in it, you'd have to get yourself implemented to the level of 110. You would need to be prepared to demonstrate compliance to the NIST 800-171 and 171A requirements. You'd need to identify a qualified C3PAO and have them scheduled to come in and do the assessment and then issue your certification before you can be awarded that contract. So just think through the time frame of all of that. There's going to be, I think, a little bit of a roadblock or traffic jam when a lot of companies want to get certified right away. I think that's probably going to be the case. Yeah. But the other potential roadblock is that you're not prepared and you can't even start the process. So this is the year to get prepared. That means, getting familiar with the requirements and getting the preparations in place and all the documentation and the technical upgrades and overhauling your network if it needs to be, or finding an alternative to overhauling your network, which there are some. This is the time to use. Redeem the moment. Redeem the time. They preach from the mountaintops. Redeem the time. This is the time for that. So, we just want to make sure that, those of you who are listening in today, you're aware of what's coming and you're well on your way to being ready.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Scott. It's good to know how to prepare, especially in the unknowns. So Rick, could you explain how the CMMC assessments will be conducted and what contractors should expect during the assessment process? Sure,
good question. A lot of this is still in process and not finalized. We mentioned how that the C3PAOs are working with the DIBCAT in this interim voluntary assessment process. But what we do know is that For this assessment process, a person needs to identify or get on a list for an assessment, identify a C3PAO when CMMC becomes a real thing, get on that schedule. There is then kind of a readiness review, if you will, where the lead assessor will look at your information to determine whether or not you're ready for the assessment. So it's kind of a prelude to the actual assessment. Then the assessment is made up of a team. Unlike maybe an ISO audit where you have one auditor, here you'll have a team of assessors, one of which would be the lead assessor, who actually controls the flow of the process and makes a lot of the determinations in conjunction with the team whether or not you are meeting that particular practice or not. We already mentioned how that this assessment process breaks down the 110 into additional categories, another 320 categories, and they're going to be looking at each one of these to verify that you are meeting that particular practice. There's three ways they can look at it. They can look at it through what you would call an interview process and an examining process, or some kind of a testing type process to validate that, yes, I'm meeting these particular controls. So once all that is done, they'll put together a finding, and then this is the high level response to that. Then they'll put that together and it will be submitted for approval process. So some of this is being worked out. We do know that it's following the NIST 800-171A process, the process that the DIBCAT's using today. So it's going to be much like that, similar to that. That's what they're training against there. It's important to note that they're expecting you for a level 2 to have all the controls in place. They've talked about, I don't know if they've finalized quite yet, there are going to be allowed, what do I say, temporary POAM items under certain conditions, but then you have a time frame that you have to put them in place, like maybe something like 120 days, that you have to have all those very minor items put in place, or you could lose that level 2 certification process. So those are some of the things. They're still working on some of this information. It may change, it may stay the same. There also is that level 1. We didn't talk too much about that. The level 1 does not require a third-party assessment or certification. It is a subset of the 110. There's 17 controls there, and that is a self-assessment. That is around the FCI, the Federal Contracting Information. It's not the CUI. So if you're only handling contract information, you would be possibly looking at that level 1 certification. And once again, that would be a self-assessment, not a third party. The level 3 assessment process, from the last I heard, is going to be only done by the DIBCAT. That's the highest level in this CMMC process. Level 2 would be done by the C3POs. And then once again, level 1 would be a self-assessment. So that's kind of the assessment process as we know it today.
Yeah.
Subject to change.
Yeah. Little asterisks there. We also have some links to some assessment documents and their objectives. We will send out the link to those, as well as the link to the recording of today's webinar, so you can have those to help prepare. Scott, since contractors need to be proactive in preparing for CMMC, how do they do that even though there's still a lot of uncertainty about its implementation?
Yeah, there is uncertainty and there's not.
Yeah.
There's not uncertainty on what's required today. And as we've said, today, to be eligible for to bid on a defense contract, you have to have a SPUR score based on NIST 800-171, the exact same requirements that will be used for CMMC certification. So any preparation that a company is making to improve their SPUR score, to improve their compliance with the 110 requirements or controls or practices, we use those terms interchangeably, I suppose, but is meaning that it's not wasted effort. You're going in the right direction, and you're working toward what is going to be needed when a third-party assessment occurs. So anything that can be done at this point is important. And so, to me, the starting point for that is some very basic questions like, and I'll just throw some out here, do we handle CUI at all? Or do we have contracts where CUI would be expected to be received or created or sent by your organization? That's a yes or no question. We do or we don't. If there's a maybe, then either talk to your customers or plan on level 2. I guess that would be my advice, because you'd hate to assume, oh no, we never handle CUI. We've never seen a CUI. If I stepped on a CUI, I wouldn't know it. Well, that's another whole webinar, Maddie, on how you sort out CUI. But technical information, if you're a manufacturer, likely any manufacturing documentation is going to be treated as CUI. I think that's a given. And so you would be planning toward handling CUI. Therefore, you're planning to be prepared for a level 2 certification. So that's like question number 1. Question number 2 is, where in the world are we going to put this stuff? Now, today, you probably send and receive this documentation through email with your customer. You might even download it off a customer website, other ways that it might be exchanged at this point. But it probably lands on your laptop or your desktop computer or your phone. And then it gets saved somewhere or forwarded to someone internally who needs to get access. So now it's on another email account and on another computer where it was saved. And now it gets backed up to a backup copy of your network data off-site somewhere. So now there's another copy off-site of that same document that is on the server, that's on my laptop, that's in my email account, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so where are we going to keep in the future? Where are we going to keep CUI? Can we, and a bigger question, I think, is could we narrow down the scope of where we keep it? Could we narrow down where we keep it? If the answer is no, meaning most of our business is defense business. A lot of departments in our company have to use the documents. It flows freely within our organization, and people need to have access. And that's just the way it is, and that's it, and that's all. Then you are kind of choosing the path, or it's chosen for you, maybe that's a way to say it, to secure your entire network. Okay? And so then you've got to do a full assessment of your entire network. That's what your SPUR score should be based on. And you should be preparing all the technical upgrades and overhauls and replacements and patches and such that are going to be needed to meet all the requirements. You're going to need to do training with all of your employees. You're going to need to be securing your whole physical facility, and protecting against outside parties just wandering in your building and such. So you'd have to protect the whole business. And that may be the case. And if that's the case, you probably want to be working with an MSP. Unless your IT department is highly skilled and trained on cybersecurity and compliance, then you probably want to get some outside help, and that would be a managed service provider in many cases, or other resource. And that there are certainly conditions or considerations when selecting an MSP to work with. Not all of them are qualified or willing to get involved in this requirement. But anyway, that would be option door number A, door number one. All right, behind door number two is an easier path for some companies who maybe not all employees need to get access to CUI. Maybe we only have a few defense contracts. Maybe we could live with using a separate system to keep our CUI, and then to get to the CUI, to work with the CUI, I would log into the separate system. That separate system, they call it an enclave, could be set up on your company network. If your MSP or IT department knows how to set up an enclave on your network and completely segregate in every respect, including email, including backup, including logging in, restricting access, then that could be a way to kind of narrow down the scope and only have to upgrade a portion of your network or a separate area. Or you could use one of the commercially available cloud systems that are designed from the bottom up to meet these requirements from throughout, and then you would, instead of having your CUI ever land on your computer or land on your phone or land on your network, it would never go there. It would never be there. It would be in the separate system. That would be an alternative. And there are commercially available products today available. Short commercial, Miss Maddie. Core Business Solutions provides a product just like that called the Core Vault. We've built a cloud-based platform. You may know we have another cloud-based platform for ISO. It's called the Core Compliance Platform. We saw that many of our small customers were going to be overwhelmed with this complexity of overhauling their network to meet these requirements. And they needed extra help, and they needed, I guess we'll call it the easy button. So we built the Core Vault. It's an AWS environment, AWS GovCloud environment that is built from scratch to meet the technical requirements to meet NIST 800-171 and provide our customers with what they call evidence artifacts, the information you'll need to show to assessors to show that it technically meets the requirements. That is what Rick's job here at Core Business Solutions is. He's the Director of Security Solutions, and he and his team build the vault and maintain it. And they are continuing to monitor changes in the requirements and in the assessment process so that the vault stays ready. And so we're keeping it up to date. And that means it does change because it has to stay up to date as we go. But it's a great way to, I don't know, jump the line. Or Rick, what do they call it in Disney World? You got if you want to jump the line, it's not that.
Fast pass?
Fast pass?
Yeah.
The fast pass.
Yeah, or the lightning lane.
There you go.
The lightning lane. Rick is a big Disney fan. If you're ever in one of our other meetings, you'll see him with a Disney hat on. But I think Rick and Mickey are related somehow. I don't know. They should be. But yeah, if you want to get in that fast line, and if it works for you to work in a segregated, work area, you should call and get some information about the vault and just check it out. Get a demo. Okay, I'm enough of a commercial, but I feel a passion for the small business who is just like a deer in the headlights trying to figure this thing out and overwhelmed with the budget to do this and don't really have a technical expert to rely on, and just see this as a big distraction to their business, just total distraction to their business.
Yeah.
So we felt like we had to step up and use our technical resources to build a vault, so we did. But anyway, those are kind of the big questions. Do we handle CUI, and where are we going to keep it? And I think once you have those two answers, then you can put a plan to implement. But if you don't answer those two questions first, you could spend a lot of time and money doing the wrong thing.
Yep.
And that would be a shame.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Scott, so much for that. Well, we have a few questions here. I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but if we don't get to all your questions, we will definitely email you with the answers. So first up, someone asked, we have been told that as a prime, all of our subs will be required to be at least CMMC 2.0 level 1 certified, even if not touching CUI. Is this correct?
If they don't touch CUI, then
Yeah, so-
level 1 would be the correct level.
Because they'd be handling FCI, yeah. So that is
Because they'd
correct.
be handling FCI. That is a correct answer. Yay, got the
Yes.
first one right. Okay.
That was easy enough. Another question is, does a managed IT service provider, a contractor that provides services for cybersecurity, so if they have global admin access, do they need to have the DFARS requirement flowed down to them? Does this manage?
I think we follow that, Maddie. Rick,
Okay.
Rick, what do you think? Do the MSPs and IT providers need to meet these requirements?
There is a lot of discussion around that today, and I've heard pros and cons with both. It's looking like an MSP, if they are providing services that interact with a client's CUI, then they indeed would have to be meet the same requirements as the client would. So it just depends what kind of services they're providing, what do they have access to, and I know there will be more to come in the future about that. Just a lot of some uncertainty there, but I suspect if they're interacting, they have access to CUI, they're going to be held accountable, just like the client is.
Yeah. So they also asked to kind of tag along with that question. If so, can this be mitigated through restricting access through written policies?
Once again, it just depends what they have access to, how they're, what kind of services they're providing to the client. But if they have, as an admin, if they have full control or access to the client's system, whether or not they actually access CUI, they have the ability to access it. So I guess that's where the thought process was, that they would need to meet the same requirements.
Hey, Rick, I would look at it in addition this way. If that MSP's system has access to CUI, then that's a security risk to the client.
Yeah,
Potential security risk to the client.
it is.
So whether or not there's a written policy isn't going to stop an intrusion through that avenue to access CUI. That's how I'm pretty sure that's exactly how it would be evaluated. If it creates a security risk, then they would probably tighten that up.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. And we have one more just quick question. I think we can answer it real quick before we go. If you have an SSP, a POAM, and a SPURS score, are you considered compliant to 252.204-7012, in parentheses, a score below 110, or do you have to have all controls in place to call your company compliant to DFARS 7012?
DFARS does not require full compliance.
Okay.
It does require all those things that were listed, but so the result of all of that is that you submit a score to demonstrate that you've implemented those controls, and you would need to have a SPURS, a SSP, and a POAM for sure, and then you need to be thinking about continual improvement of that score.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is you can't say, well, we're planning to do that. They want a date when you suspect
Yeah.
that you'll have all those controls met. Now you can update it from time to time, but they want you to commit to getting those controls in place.
And we actually
To
did-
get to the 110, right?
Yes.
Right? Yeah, to get all the way
Correct.
to the 110. Yeah.
Correct.
We did have one last question that pops in. I think we can answer this one quick. Can international companies in the DIB supply chain store CUI overseas?
I would say no.
Yeah.
Basically, no.
Okay.
Not right now with regard to the way that CMMC is being written and
Okay.
how the assessments are going to unfold. There is discussion about expanding CMMC to other parts of the U.S. government and to certain countries internationally, but I think we're way out over our skis to even answer that question definitively.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Those were excellent questions. And we want to thank you again for joining us today as we reviewed the CMMC updates. I'm hopeful that you feel more confident in your understanding of what's happening with CMMC and that you feel better prepared for what requirements are coming up. Members of our consulting team are available to help you better prepare for CMMC. Our experts are able to help you lay out a plan for CMMC and get all your information secured. If you're interested in more information about our CMMC programs for small businesses, please contact us at info@thecoresolution.com. I also want to thank all of our co-sponsors again for promoting today's webinar and taking part in sharing this important information about CMMC. I would like to take a quick moment to share some more information about some of our Apex accelerators. Apex accelerators are a bridge between business and government. They're funded by federal and state sources. It's a nationwide program with 94 centers and approximately 630 counselors. You'll see here on the next slide, this is a map of all the Apex accelerators for Pennsylvania specifically. Apex accelerators can help you with vendor registrations and certifications, identifying government markets and specific contracting opportunities, assisting with bid and proposal preparation, and so much more. The name changed to Apex Accelerators in November 2022, and they reached or had a new funding source from the DoD Office of Small Business Development. It's all the same services and to the same clients and same communities. The name just changed. You can find your local Apex Accelerators at www.aptech-us.org. And here is some PA Apex accelerators for contact information so you can find yours if you're in Pennsylvania. Finally, next month, we'll be having a webinar on CMMC, how to prepare. This presentation will dive deeper into how to prepare for CMMC. Please join us on Thursday, May 18th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to learn more about CMMC preparation. As we wrap up, I want to thank you again for joining us today. Please stay safe and let us know if you have any questions from today's session or would like more information about CMMC or CMMC programs. Take care.